Central Asia. 1320. The endless grassland stretched across thousands of miles, broken only by sparse settlements and the occasional Silk Road caravansary. The landscape was empty enough that a person could travel for days without seeing another human being. The wind howled across the steppes, carrying dust and the distant cries of eagles hunting for prey. But beneath the surface, invisible to human eyes, something was happening. A bacterium was mutating inside the gut of a flea, which lived on the body of a rat, which lived in a colony near the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains. The bacterium was Yersinia pestis, and it had just evolved into something far more lethal than its previous form. This single mutation, occurring in one microscopic organism in one flea in one rat in one colony in the vastness of Central Asia, would ultimately kill 75 to 200 million people across 3 continents over the course of 5 years. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. This is documented historical reality, verified by genetic analysis of plague victims remains extracted from mass graves across Europe. A single genetic alteration in a bacterium smaller than a red blood cell would cascade into the greatest catastrophe in human history. And it all started with one species, Ratus ratus, the black rat. The black rat had been living alongside humans for thousands of years. They originated in South Asia, probably in the Indian subcontinent, where they evolved as forest dwellers living in trees and feeding on seeds and fruits. Their natural habitat was the dense tropical forests where they developed remarkable climbing abilities and omnivorous feeding behaviors. But at some point in prehistory, these rats discovered something remarkable. Humans were extraordinarily wasteful. Humans stored grain in buildings that could be infiltrated. Humans threw away food scraps that rats could scavenge. Humans created garbage heaps that became buffets. Humans built cities that were, from a rat's perspective, essentially elaborate feeding and breeding habitats constructed specifically for their benefit. The rats adapted. They moved from forests into human settlements. They evolved behaviors that made them extraordinary urban survivors. They became neophobic, suspicious of new objects and careful in their exploration. This trait protected them from traps and poisons that humans would later develop. They became nocturnal to avoid human detection, emerging from their hiding places only after sunset when the streets were empty and the risk of human interference was minimal. They became incredibly reproductively successful, with females capable of producing 6 litters per year, each containing 6 to 8 pups. The gestation period was only 21 days, meaning a female could be pregnant, give birth, and become pregnant again within a single month. A single breeding pair of rats, under ideal conditions with unlimited food and no predation, could produce 15,000 descendants in a single year. The mathematics of exponential reproduction meant that once rats established themselves in a human settlement, they became virtually impossible to eliminate. The rat's physiology was perfectly suited to urban survival. Their teeth grew continuously throughout their lives at a rate of approximately 5 inches per year, requiring constant gnawing to maintain proper length. This meant they could chew through wood, plaster, concrete, even soft metals like lead and aluminum. They could gnaw through the walls of granaries, the floors of warehouses, the hulls of ships. Archaeological evidence shows rat damage on wooden structures dating back thousands of years. Their skeletal structure was remarkably flexible, with a collapsible rib cage and joints that could rotate in ways impossible for most mammals. A rat could squeeze through any opening large enough to fit its skull, which for an adult rat meant gaps as small as half an inch in diameter. They could climb vertical surfaces using their sharp claws and prehensile tails for balance, ascending brick walls and wooden posts with the ease of squirrels. They could swim for 3 days continuously if necessary, holding their breath for 3 minutes underwater. Sailors reported seeing rats swimming between ships in harbors, transferring from vessel to vessel in search of better food sources. They could survive falls from heights of 50 feet without sustaining serious injury due to their low body mass and ability to spread their bodies to increase air resistance. They were, in engineering terms, nearly indestructible creatures, adapted to survive in the most hostile urban environments humans could create. Their sensory systems were equally impressive. Rats possessed excellent hearing, capable of detecting ultrasonic frequencies up to 90 kHz, far beyond human perception which tops out around 20 kHz. This allowed them to communicate with other rats using vocalizations humans could not hear, coordinating their movements and warning of dangers. Their sense of smell was extraordinarily acute, with olfactory receptors that could detect food sources from distances of over a mile under optimal conditions and navigate complex environments in complete darkness. Their whiskers, called vibrissae, provided tactile information about their immediate surroundings, creating a three-dimensional map of spaces they inhabited even in total darkness. Each whisker could detect air currents, texture changes, and proximity to objects. They were, biologically speaking, superb survivors equipped with every adaptation necessary to exploit human civilization. By the medieval period, rats had spread throughout Eurasia, following trade routes and human migration patterns with the tenacity of a shadow that could not be shaken. They traveled on ships, hiding in cargo holds and eating stored provisions. Maritime records from Venetian and Genoese merchants mention the constant problem of rats consuming grain shipments, sometimes destroying up to 20% of cargo on long voyages. They traveled on caravans, nestled among bales of silk and sacks of grain, emerging at night to feed on the supplies intended for human travelers. They moved along the Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting east and west, spreading from city to city, settlement to settlement, following the expansion of human commerce. They were cosmopolitan, adaptable, and extraordinarily successful. And they were carrying something that would transform history: fleas. Not just any fleas, but specifically Xenocilla chaopes, the oriental rat flea. This flea species had co-evolved with rats over millions of years, developing a life cycle and feeding behavior perfectly adapted to rat hosts. The fleas lived in rat fur, their dark bodies camouflaged against the rat's brown or black coat. They fed on rat blood multiple times per day, requiring frequent blood meals to survive and reproduce. They reproduced in rat nests, laying eggs in the accumulated debris of rat habitats, the mixture of feces, urine, shed fur, and food scraps that rats created wherever they lived. The eggs hatched into larvae that fed on organic matter in the nest, eventually pupating and emerging as adult fleas ready to infest new rat hosts. They were, in every meaningful sense, rat parasites, dependent on their hosts for survival. But fleas are not monogamous in their feeding. If a flea's primary host died, the flea would seek another host within hours, driven by the desperate need for blood. If rats were unavailable, fleas would feed on humans, cats, dogs, or any other warm-blooded animal they could access. This flexibility, the ability to switch hosts, was the crucial factor that made plague transmission to humans possible. The flea's biology was as precisely engineered for disease transmission as the rat's was for urban survival. An adult flea could jump 150 times its own body length vertically and 300 times its own body length horizontally, equivalent to a human jumping over 1,000 feet horizontally and 500 feet vertically. This jumping ability allowed fleas to rapidly move between hosts, launching themselves from dying rats to living humans with explosive force generated by a specialized protein called resilin in their leg joints. Fleas could survive for months without feeding, lying dormant in rat nests and bedding, their metabolic rate slowing to near hibernation levels, waiting for a host to return. Female fleas required blood meals to produce eggs, creating evolutionary pressure to feed frequently and aggressively. A single female could lay up to 500 eggs in her lifetime, ensuring that flea populations could explode rapidly when conditions were favorable. And most critically, fleas had a digestive system that could be blocked by bacterial growth. When a flea fed on a rat infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria would multiply in the flea's proventriculus, the valve between the esophagus and the midgut. The bacteria formed a solid biofilm mass that prevented blood from reaching the flea's stomach. The blocked flea would attempt to feed more frequently, driven by starvation, and each attempted feeding would inject plague bacteria directly into the new host's bloodstream as the flea regurgitated the bacterial mass while trying to draw blood. The flea became, through bacterial manipulation, a hypodermic needle for plague transmission, a biological syringe that injected death with every bite. The bacterium had essentially hijacked the flea's feeding behavior, transforming it into an optimized transmission vector that would spread plague with ruthless efficiency. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had existed for millennia, probably originating in Central Asian rodent populations where it circulated as an endemic disease maintained in wild marmots, ground squirrels, and other burrowing rodents. Genetic analysis of ancient plague strains suggests the bacterium evolved from Yersinia pseudotuberculosis approximately 20,000 years ago, gradually developing the virulence factors that made it one of the deadliest pathogens in human history. Most of the time, plague remained confined to these rodent reservoirs, circulating through wild populations without ever reaching humans. Rats would die. Fleas would die. The bacterium would persist in survivor populations, cycling through rodent communities without ever breaking out into human populations. The ecological balance maintained itself for thousands of years. But occasionally, conditions would align in catastrophic ways. A mutation would occur that made the bacterium more virulent, more capable of overwhelming mammalian immune systems. A population explosion among rats would create ideal conditions for flea reproduction, with dense concentrations of hosts allowing fleas to reproduce exponentially. A drought or ecological disruption would drive infected rodents into closer contact with human settlements as they searched for food and water. And when these factors converged, genetic mutation, population density, environmental stress, and human proximity, plague would spill over from its animal reservoir into human populations with devastating consequences. This is what happened in the 1320s in Central Asia. The conditions aligned perfectly, like tumblers in a lock all falling into place simultaneously. Plague began circulating through rat populations along the trade routes. The rats, living in close proximity to humans in cities and caravanserais, began dying in massive numbers. Dead rats appeared in streets, in warehouses, in homes. The fleas, desperate for hosts as their primary rat hosts died, began biting humans at unprecedented rates. And the spillover began. The first human cases probably occurred among traders and merchants who handled goods infested with infected fleas. A merchant loading silk bales in Samarkand would feel a flea bite on his ankle, a minor irritation he would dismiss without thought. Within days, he would develop fever, his body temperature spiking to 104 degrees Fahrenheit as his immune system mounted a desperate response to bacterial invasion. Within a week, he would be dead, black buboes swelling in his groin and armpits to the size of chicken eggs, his extremities turning gangrenous black as blood vessels collapsed and tissue died. His family would tend to him, washing his fevered body, changing his bedding, bringing him food and water, all the while contracting plague from his fleas. His business partners would visit, sitting at his bedside discussing affairs and making arrangements for his estate, carrying plague away to their own homes on their clothing and in their hair. The disease began spreading through the trade networks, following the same routes that made the Silk Road profitable. By the 1330s, plague was epidemic in China, killing millions and disrupting the Mongol Empire's control of Central Asia. Chronicles from the period describe cities where the dead outnumbered the living, where corpses lay in streets for days because there was no one left to bury them, where the stench of death was so overwhelming that survivors fled into the countryside abandoning everything they owned. In some regions, entire villages were depopulated, reduced to empty buildings and silent streets where only rats remained, scurrying through abandoned homes and feeding on the corpses of their former occupants. The Mongol Empire, which had united most of Eurasia under a single political system and thereby facilitated unprecedented trade and communication, became a transmission highway for plague. The very connectivity that made the empire prosperous became its vulnerability. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that had allowed safe travel across thousands of miles, became the mechanism by which plague spread from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. By the early 1340s, plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Mongol armies besieging the Genoese trading post of Kaffa catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, one of history's first documented uses of biological warfare. The Mongol Khan Janabeg, leading the siege, understood that something inside his camp was killing his soldiers at an alarming rate. He watched as hundreds of his men developed the characteristic black buboes and died screaming in agony. He understood that the disease seemed to spread from corpses, that handling the dead increased the risk of infection. And he made the calculated decision to weaponize the disease by launching infected bodies into the besieged city using trebuchets and catapults. The psychological impact was as devastating as the biological impact. The defenders of Kaffa watched rotting corpses arc over their walls and land in their streets with sickening thuds, bringing death with them. The city attempted to dispose of the corpses by throwing them into the sea, but the damage was already done. The fleas had spread. The Genoese traders, recognizing that their position was untenable, fled Kaffa with plague-infected rats in their ships, carried the disease to the Mediterranean. 12 ships departed Kaffa in October 1347, their holds filled with silk, spices, and death. And from there, plague exploded into Europe with a force that would reshape civilization. The rat was central to every stage of this process. Without rats, plague would have remained isolated in wild rodent populations in the mountains and steppes of Central Asia, killing marmots and ground squirrels but never reaching human cities. Without rats living in close proximity to humans, sharing their buildings and eating their food, fleas would never have developed the host-switching behavior that made human infection possible. Without rats traveling on ships and caravans, plague would never have spread beyond its Central Asian origins, never reaching the densely populated cities of Europe where it would kill tens of millions. The rat was the reservoir, maintaining plague in urban environments even when human cases temporarily declined. The rat was the amplifier, providing the dense population of hosts necessary for plague bacteria to multiply to pandemic levels. The rat was the delivery mechanism for catastrophe, carrying plague-infected fleas into every city, town, and village in the medieval world. The rat was, in every meaningful sense, the vector that made the Black Death possible. And here is the terrifying part. Humans had no understanding of this relationship. Medieval people saw rats. They knew rats infested their cities and homes. They complained about rats eating stored food, damaging property, creating filth. Some cities employed rat catchers who killed rats by the hundreds using dogs, traps, and clubs. But they had no concept of disease transmission. They did not understand that rats carried fleas, that fleas carried bacteria, that bacteria caused disease. They had no framework for understanding vector-borne illness, no mental model for how invisible organisms could spread from animals to humans. When plague arrived, they blamed God's wrath, interpreting the pandemic as divine punishment for humanity's sins. They blamed miasmas and corrupted air, believing that foul smells emanating from swamps and garbage heaps caused disease. They blamed astrological alignments, noting that plague arrived during certain planetary configurations. They blamed Jews and lepers and foreigners, launching pogroms and massacres based on false conspiracy theories. They blamed everything except the actual cause, which was living in their walls and eating their grain, scurrying through their streets at night, invisible and ignored. The medical establishment of the time was completely unprepared, operating within a theoretical framework that was fundamentally incorrect. Physicians believed in the humoral theory of disease, the idea that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory had dominated Western medicine for over 1,000 years, based on the writings of ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. According to humoral theory, plague victims suffered from an excess of black bile, which caused the blackening of flesh and the melancholic temperament that preceded death. They believed plague was caused by corrupted air, by astrological alignments that disturbed the balance of elements, by divine punishment for sin. They recommended treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful: bloodletting, which weakened already dying patients by removing the very blood their bodies needed to fight infection; purging through induced vomiting and diarrhea, which dehydrated patients and accelerated their decline; poultices of crushed emeralds applied to buboes, which did nothing but waste precious gemstones; prayers and flagellation, which spread infection as people gathered in crowds to perform public penance. Not a single medieval treatment for plague was effective because none of them addressed the actual cause. The physicians had no mental model for bacteria, no concept of microscopic organisms that could invade the body and cause disease. The microscope would not be invented for another 300 years. They could not see fleas as disease vectors because they did not understand disease vectors existed. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not understand, and could not conceptualize. And so they lost, catastrophically, as 75 million people died over 5 years. One physician in Paris, Guy de Chauliac, documented his experiences treating plague victims in meticulous detail that survives in medical manuscripts to this day. He described the symptoms: sudden fever that burned patients from the inside, swelling of lymph nodes in the groin and armpits that grew to the size of apples, blackening of extremities as tissue necrotized, delirium that caused patients to scream and thrash, and death within 3 to 5 days of symptom onset. He noted that the disease seemed to spread through contact, that physicians who treated plague victims often contracted the disease themselves within days of exposure. He observed that fleeing the sick seemed to offer some protection, but he also noted that many who fled carried the disease with them to new locations, spreading plague to previously uninfected areas. His observations were remarkably accurate given his lack of understanding of microbiology. He correctly identified person-to-person transmission and recognized that proximity to the sick increased infection risk. But accuracy of observation did not translate to effective treatment. De Chauliac himself contracted plague and survived, one of the lucky 20% who recovered from bubonic plague without treatment. He attributed his survival to God's grace and to bleeding himself at the first sign of symptoms, not understanding that survival was largely determined by bacterial load at initial infection, individual immune system response, and sheer biological chance. He had survived despite his treatment, not because of it. The aftermath fundamentally transformed European civilization in ways that would echo through the next 700 years. With 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dead, labor became scarce almost overnight. Peasants who had been tied to feudal lords for generations, unable to leave their assigned lands without permission, suddenly had bargaining power for the first time in their lives. They demanded higher wages, sometimes 3 or 4 times their pre-plague compensation. They moved to new territories, seeking lords who would offer better terms. They negotiated for freedom from serfdom, trading their obligatory labor for cash rent. Some lords, desperate for workers to harvest their fields and maintain their estates, offered freedom from serfdom in exchange for labor contracts. The feudal system, which had dominated European social organization for 600 years, began its slow collapse, eventually giving way to wage labor and early capitalism. The labor shortage created unprecedented economic opportunities for survivors. Wages for agricultural workers tripled in some regions between 1350 and 1375. Skilled craftsmen could demand compensation that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Some peasants acquired land left vacant by plague deaths, becoming landowners for the first time in their family histories, breaking the rigid class boundaries that had constrained their ancestors for generations. The economic restructuring was profound and permanent, setting in motion changes that would culminate in the Renaissance, the rise of merchant capitalism, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. The Church, which had promised that faith would protect believers from harm, lost credibility as priests died alongside parishioners at equal or higher rates. The clergy had been disproportionately affected by plague because they provided spiritual care to the dying, administering last rites and hearing final confessions, bringing them into close contact with plague victims and their fleas. Entire monasteries were wiped out, with mortality rates exceeding 90% in some religious communities. In some dioceses, 70% of priests died during the first wave of plague in 1348 to 1349, creating a shortage of clergy that would take generations to remedy. The survivors faced a crisis of faith and authority that shook the foundations of medieval Christianity. If God allowed the faithful to die at the same rate as sinners, what did that say about divine justice? If prayer and penance did not protect against plague, what was the purpose of religious devotion? If the sacraments could not save the dying, what power did the Church actually possess? These questions did not have satisfactory answers, at least not answers that the Church hierarchy was willing to provide. Religious skepticism increased among the educated classes. Mysticism and apocalyptic movements flourished among the common people, with flagellants marching from city to city whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. The questioning of church authority during the plague years planted seeds that would eventually grow into the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. The Black Death marked the beginning of the end of the Church's unquestioned dominance over European intellectual and spiritual life. Art became obsessed with death in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The danse macabre, or dance of death, emerged as a new artistic genre showing skeletons dancing with the living. Memento mori imagery reminding viewers of mortality's inevitability appeared in paintings and sculptures across Europe. Before the plague, art had been dominated by religious themes of salvation and eternal life, depicting Christ's resurrection and the glory of heaven. After the plague, art became preoccupied with death's universality and inevitability. Paintings showed death as a skeleton or corpse, dancing with people of all social classes in elaborate processions. Kings and paupers, bishops and beggars, wealthy merchants and poor laborers, all danced with death as equals in these macabre tableaus. The message was clear: death comes for everyone regardless of wealth, power, or piety. This was a radical leveling message in a rigidly hierarchical society. It suggested that earthly status was ultimately meaningless, that all social distinctions dissolved in the face of mortality. Literature turned dark, focused on the transience of life and the futility of worldly pursuits. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, depicted a group of young nobles fleeing Florence and telling stories to pass the time while death raged in the city below. The entire cultural apparatus of medieval Europe was transformed by collective trauma, by the shared experience of watching half the population die within 5 years. But the rat remained. Even as millions died, even as cities depopulated and fields lay fallow, rats continued thriving in Europe's cities. They continued breeding at exponential rates, taking advantage of abundant food supplies left behind by dead humans. They continued carrying fleas, maintaining plague in urban rat populations even when human cases temporarily subsided. And plague continued erupting periodically for the next 400 years, killing thousands or millions in recurring waves that would devastate Europe repeatedly. The second pandemic, as historians call it, began with the Black Death in 1347 and continued through recurring outbreaks until the early 18th century. London suffered major plague outbreaks in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and most famously in 1665, when the Great Plague killed approximately 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of London's population. The pattern was grimly predictable with each outbreak. Plague would erupt in one neighborhood, typically the poorest districts where housing density was highest and sanitation was worst. It would spread through crowded tenements, killing entire families within days. It would jump to adjacent neighborhoods, following patterns of human movement and rat infestation. It would kill thousands over several months, then mysteriously subside until the next outbreak years or decades later. Each epidemic followed the same trajectory: exponential growth in cases as person-to-person and flea-to-person transmission accelerated, social disruption as the wealthy fled and the poor died, mass death overwhelming burial capacity, and eventual decline as the susceptible population was exhausted. And each time, rats were the constant factor, the ever-present reservoir maintaining plague in urban ecosystems, ready to amplify and spread the disease whenever conditions became favorable. Milan, Venice, and other Italian cities experienced devastating outbreaks in the 1630s that killed hundreds of thousands. The Venetian outbreak of 1630 to 1631 killed approximately 50,000 people, nearly a third of the city's population. Venice, that magnificent maritime republic built on islands and canals, saw its population collapse from 140,000 to 90,000 in 18 months. Venice responded by building the Church of Santa Maria della Salute, a massive Baroque cathedral constructed as a votive offering to thank the Virgin Mary for ending the plague. The church stands today at the entrance to the Grand Canal, a monument to plague's impact on the city, its white marble dome visible for miles as a reminder of the catastrophe that nearly destroyed Venice. Marseille suffered a catastrophic outbreak in 1720 that killed perhaps half the city's population in one of the last major plague epidemics in Western Europe. The plague arrived on a merchant ship called the Grand Saint-Antoine, which had departed from Sidon in the Levant carrying silk and cotton. Rats in the cargo hold were infected with plague. The ship's surgeon and several crew members died during the voyage, but the captain concealed these deaths to avoid quarantine. When the ship docked in Marseille, rats disembarked along with the cargo. Within weeks, plague was spreading through the city. The city attempted quarantine, erecting walls to seal off infected neighborhoods, but the measures were implemented too late and enforced too poorly to stop transmission. Within months, Marseille was devastated, its streets filled with corpses that overwhelmed the city's burial capacity, its economy destroyed as trade ceased and businesses closed, its population decimated by a disease that city officials had tried desperately to keep out. Each time, the pattern was the same. Rats carried infected fleas into cities, fleas bit humans, humans died in massive numbers, and the social fabric nearly collapsed under the weight of mortality. And each time, people failed to identify the rat as the crucial vector because they still did not understand disease transmission, still blamed miasmas and divine punishment, still implemented measures that could not work because they targeted the wrong causes. It was not until the late 19th century, more than 500 years after the Black Death, that science finally identified the mechanism of plague transmission. In 1894, during the third pandemic that was devastating Hong Kong and spreading through southern China, a Swiss bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium responsible for plague. Yersin had traveled to Hong Kong specifically to study the disease, competing with Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo to be the first to identify the causative organism. Yersin cultured bacteria from buboes of plague victims, growing the organisms in laboratory conditions and observing them under a microscope. He demonstrated that this organism caused the disease by injecting it into laboratory animals and reproducing plague symptoms. The bacterium was named Yersinia pestis in his honor, recognizing his achievement in solving one of medicine's greatest mysteries. A few years later, in 1898, a French scientist named Paul-Louis Simon demonstrated that fleas were the vector, showing that plague spread when fleas fed on infected rats and then bit humans. Simon conducted meticulous experiments with rats and fleas in conditions that would be considered ethically questionable by modern standards, documenting the exact transmission pathway. He placed healthy rats in cages with infected rats, separated by screens that prevented direct contact but allowed fleas to pass through. The healthy rats developed plague, proving that some agent must be transferring between cages. He identified fleas as that agent through careful observation and experimentation. He showed that plague could not spread through air or casual contact, but only through the bite of an infected flea. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, people understood the transmission chain, bacterium to rat to flea to human. The mystery that had terrorized humanity for centuries finally had an answer. And understanding the mechanism made prevention possible in ways that medieval quarantines and prayers never could. Cities began systematic rat control programs based on scientific understanding of plague ecology. They improved sanitation to eliminate rat habitats, clearing garbage heaps and drainage ditches where rats bred. They developed rat poisons using compounds like arsenic and strychnine, though these early poisons were often as dangerous to humans as to rats. They quarantined ships and inspected cargo for rat infestations, fumigating vessels that showed signs of rodent presence. The city of San Francisco, during its plague outbreak of 1900 to 1904, implemented one of the first comprehensive rat control campaigns in American history. Teams of workers trapped and killed rats by the hundreds of thousands, collecting bounties for each rat tail turned in to public health authorities. They inspected buildings for rat entry points and sealed them with metal mesh and concrete. They improved garbage collection to eliminate food sources, implementing regular waste removal schedules. They fumigated ships arriving from Asia using sulfur dioxide and later hydrogen cyanide gas, killing rats and fleas in cargo holds before ships were allowed to unload. And remarkably, these measures worked. Plague cases declined dramatically. By the mid-20th century, plague had essentially disappeared from developed countries, not because the bacterium went extinct, but because rat populations were controlled and flea transmission was interrupted through systematic public health interventions. But the rat did not disappear. Today, rats remain one of the most successful mammalian species on Earth, thriving in virtually every environment humans have created. Ratus ratus and its close relative Ratus norvegicus, the brown rat, inhabit every continent except Antarctica. They live in cities, towns, villages, and agricultural areas on every inhabited landmass. They live in subway systems and sewers beneath major metropolises. They live in warehouses and shipping ports, maintaining their ancient association with human commerce. They live, essentially, wherever humans live, because humans continue creating ideal rat habitats through food waste, inadequate sanitation, and complex built environments with countless hiding places. Modern estimates suggest there are billions of rats worldwide, with rat populations in some urban areas equaling or exceeding human populations. New York City, famously, has an estimated rat population of 2 million, roughly 1 rat for every 4 humans, though some estimates suggest the actual number may be much higher since rats are notoriously difficult to count. Paris, London, Mumbai, Shanghai. All major cities support enormous rat populations numbering in the millions. Tokyo spends over $100 million annually on rat control and still cannot eliminate its rat population. And many of these rats still carry fleas. And those fleas still carry Yersinia pestis in certain regions where plague remains endemic in rodent populations. Plague is not extinct. It exists today in endemic form in parts of Africa, particularly Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Central Asia including Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and even in the southwestern United States, where it persists in wild rodent populations like prairie dogs, ground squirrels, and chipmunks. There are approximately 2,000 to 3,000 cases of plague reported globally each year, with actual numbers likely higher due to underreporting in regions with limited public health infrastructure. Most cases occur in rural areas where humans contact infected rodents or fleas through activities like hunting, farming, or simply living in proximity to wild rodent populations. The mortality rate, however, has plummeted compared to medieval times. With antibiotics, specifically streptomycin, gentamicin, doxycycline, or ciprofloxacin, plague is highly treatable if caught early and diagnosed correctly. The case fatality rate with prompt antibiotic treatment is less than 5%, compared to 60 to 90% without treatment. Modern medicine has essentially neutered plague's lethality, transforming it from civilization-ending catastrophe to manageable infectious disease that kills only dozens instead of millions. But here is the uncomfortable truth that keeps epidemiologists awake at night. Our protection depends entirely on antibiotics remaining effective and accessible. If antibiotic resistance became widespread in Yersinia pestis strains, if the bacterium evolved resistance to our primary drugs through the same mechanisms that have made other bacteria resistant, we would be back to medieval vulnerability almost overnight. The bacterium would again become a mass killer capable of devastating human populations. And the rat would still be the vector, still living in our cities by the millions, still carrying fleas, still capable of initiating the transmission chain that leads to human infection on pandemic scales. We have not eliminated the threat the rat represents. We have only suppressed it through medical technology and public health measures. The same species that carried doom to 75 million people in the 14th century is still here, still thriving, still perfectly adapted to urban environments, still capable of carrying doom again if conditions align in catastrophic ways. The rat that changed everything has not gone away. It is living in the walls of buildings, in the sewers beneath streets, in the cargo holds of ships crossing oceans. It is adaptable, resilient, and extraordinarily successful at exploiting human environments. It is, in many ways, the ultimate urban survivor, more successful at living in cities than almost any other mammalian species except humans themselves, and possibly more successful than humans when measured by sheer population numbers and global distribution. Consider the biology that makes rats such effective vectors for disease. They are commensal species, meaning they live in close association with humans without providing any benefit. They are not domesticated, not symbiotic, simply parasitic on human infrastructure, taking from us without giving anything in return. They are neophobic but also exploratory, which means they carefully investigate new environments before fully committing, making them extraordinarily difficult to trap or poison. They will avoid a new food source for days or weeks, testing it cautiously before consuming it in quantity, a behavior that frustrates pest control efforts. They are omnivorous, capable of eating almost anything humans eat, plus garbage, feces, paper, soap, and even cannibalistic consumption of other rats when food is scarce. They can survive on as little as 1 ounce of food per day. They are prolific breeders, reaching sexual maturity in just 5 weeks and producing multiple litters per year throughout their 2 to 3 year lifespan. They are intelligent, capable of learning trap avoidance and developing behavioral traditions that get passed through rat populations, with younger rats learning from older ones which foods are safe and which places should be avoided. They have flexible skeletal structures that allow them to squeeze through openings as small as a quarter, making exclusion strategies nearly impossible to implement perfectly. They can swim, covering distances of half a mile in open water, climb vertical surfaces of brick and wood, and gnaw through most building materials given enough time. They are, in biological terms, perfectly designed to exploit human settlements, possessing every trait necessary to thrive in urban environments. And this is why rat control, despite billions of dollars spent annually on rodent management worldwide, remains an ongoing challenge in virtually every city on Earth. The evolutionary relationship between rats and humans is a case study in unintentional symbiosis and coevolution. Humans did not domesticate rats the way we domesticated dogs and cats. We did not select for traits we found useful. Rats selected themselves, exploiting the ecological niche we created through urbanization, agriculture, and food storage. They evolved to thrive in our environments, developing traits that made them successful urban survivors. And in doing so, they became integral to the disease ecology that has shaped human history in profound ways. Plague is the most dramatic example of rat-borne disease, but rats also carry leptospirosis, a bacterial disease transmitted through rat urine that infects thousands of people annually and can cause kidney failure and death. They carry hantavirus, which causes hemorrhagic fever with fatality rates approaching 40% in some outbreaks. They carry salmonella and numerous other bacterial pathogens. They are, from an epidemiological perspective, walking disease reservoirs, maintaining pathogens in their populations and periodically transmitting them to humans. And yet we have never successfully eliminated them, despite centuries of concerted effort by every major civilization. Medieval cities tried to control rat populations through various means. They employed rat catchers who killed rats by the thousands using specially trained terrier dogs, traps, and clubs. Some rat catchers became wealthy from their profession, collecting bounties for each rat killed. But it made no difference to overall rat populations. Victorian cities implemented massive sanitation reforms, building sewer systems and implementing garbage collection, hoping to starve rats out by eliminating their food sources. Rat populations declined in some areas but never disappeared, adapting to new urban environments as quickly as humans could redesign them. Modern cities use sophisticated approaches including anticoagulant poisons like warfarin and brodifacoum, snap traps and glue traps, exclusion techniques that seal buildings against rat entry, and even birth control chemicals that sterilize rat populations. Rats adapt to every intervention. They evolve resistance to poisons through natural selection, with resistant individuals surviving and breeding while susceptible ones die. They learn to avoid traps through individual learning and social transmission of avoidance behaviors. They find new entry points into buildings no matter how carefully humans seal them. The war against rats is a war we have never won and likely never will win, because rats are too adaptable, too prolific, too intelligent, and too good at exploiting the environments we create. Every intervention we develop eventually fails or requires endless repetition at enormous cost. This raises an unsettling question that becomes more relevant with each passing year. If we cannot eliminate rats, and if rats remain capable of carrying plague and other diseases, are we forever vulnerable to pandemic plague? The answer is complicated and depends on multiple interconnected factors. Antibiotics provide robust protection as long as they remain effective and accessible to infected patients. The development of streptomycin in the 1940s transformed plague from a death sentence to a treatable condition, reducing mortality from 60% to less than 5% almost overnight. Public health infrastructure, surveillance systems that detect plague cases early, rapid diagnostic tools that identify infections quickly, outbreak response protocols that contain transmission, and public education that teaches people to avoid contact with wild rodents, provides additional protection. But these are fragile systems that depend on functioning societies and adequate funding. Antibiotic resistance is rising globally at an alarming rate, with bacteria evolving resistance to even last-resort drugs like colistin and carbapenems. While Yersinia pestis has not yet developed widespread resistance, the genetic mechanisms that enable resistance can spread between bacterial species. Supply chains for pharmaceuticals can be disrupted by war, economic collapse, natural disasters, or pandemics that overwhelm production capacity. Public health infrastructure can be underfunded, politicized, or simply overwhelmed by multiple simultaneous crises competing for limited resources. We saw during COVID-19 how quickly modern health systems can be strained to breaking points by a pathogen far less lethal than plague. Hospitals filled beyond capacity. Supply chains for medical equipment collapsed. Healthcare workers died from infection. Governments implemented lockdowns that devastated economies. And COVID-19 had a case fatality rate of approximately 1 to 2% overall, far lower than plague's 60% without treatment. Imagine if COVID-19 had the lethality of untreated plague. Imagine if hospitals filled with patients developing gangrenous buboes, dying within days of symptom onset despite the best modern medical care. Imagine if antibiotics were unavailable or ineffective because resistance had evolved or supply chains had collapsed. The scenario quickly becomes medieval in its horror, with mortality rates and social disruption rivaling the Black Death. And the vector, the rat, would still be there, still thriving by the millions in every major city, still doing what rats have done for millennia. Living in close proximity to humans, carrying fleas, serving as the amplification host for Yersinia pestis, ready to spread plague whenever conditions become favorable for transmission. The lesson of the Black Death is not just historical curiosity or academic interest. It is an urgent warning about ecological relationships we do not fully control and vulnerabilities we have not eliminated despite our technological advancement. We live in a world densely populated with animals that carry pathogens capable of spilling over into human populations and causing pandemics. Rats are one example among many. Bats, which carry coronaviruses including the ancestors of SARS-CoV-2 and other viruses, are another reservoir of pandemic potential. Pigs and birds, which serve as mixing vessels for influenza viruses where animal and human strains can recombine to create new pandemic strains, represent ongoing threats. Mosquitoes carrying dengue, Zika, yellow fever, and malaria kill hundreds of thousands annually. We live in what scientists call a zoonotic world, where most emerging infectious diseases, approximately 75% according to WHO estimates, originate in animals and cross over to humans through various transmission pathways. And our vulnerability to these spillovers has not decreased despite medical advances. If anything, it has increased, because we are more interconnected than ever before in history. A disease that emerges in one city can reach every other city on Earth within days, carried by air travelers on international flights. A mutation in one virus or bacterium can spread globally before public health systems can detect it and respond. We are living in conditions that favor pandemic emergence and rapid global spread more than any previous era in human history. We have better medicine than medieval people had, sophisticated diagnostic tools and treatments they could never have imagined. But we also have 8 billion people living at unprecedented densities in megacities, more international travel connecting every population, more ecological disruption driving animals into contact with humans, and more opportunities for pathogens to jump species and spread rapidly through susceptible populations. The calculation of pandemic risk is not straightforward, and it does not clearly favor modern humans over our medieval ancestors in some fundamental way. The rat remains at the center of this risk calculation for plague specifically. There are billions of rats living in close association with humans globally. There are billions of fleas living on those rats, feeding on their blood and reproducing in their nests. There are trillions upon trillions of Yersinia pestis bacteria living in those fleas in plague-endemic regions, cycling through rat and flea populations, waiting for conditions that favor spillover into human populations. The transmission chain still exists intact, unchanged in its essential nature from the chain that killed 75 million people in the 14th century. The conditions that made the Black Death possible, rats living in human environments, fleas capable of switching from rat to human hosts, bacteria capable of overwhelming human immune systems, still exist. What has changed is our ability to interrupt that transmission chain through antibiotics that kill bacteria, sanitation that controls rat populations, and public health measures that contain outbreaks. But these interventions are not permanent or guaranteed to work forever. They are contingent on functioning societies, functioning supply chains, functioning medical systems, and continued investment in public health infrastructure. And history demonstrates repeatedly that these systems can fail catastrophically. Civilizations collapse when environmental conditions change or internal contradictions become unsustainable. Empires fall when they overextend or face challenges they cannot adapt to quickly enough. Pandemics overwhelm medical capacity when they spread faster than systems can respond. And when systems fail, when the scaffolding of modern civilization cracks under stress, we revert to biological reality. Humans are vulnerable to infectious disease, rats carry infectious disease, and the intersection of these facts can produce catastrophe on the scale of the Black Death or worse given our current population densities. So here we are, nearly 700 years after the Black Death devastated medieval civilization, living in cities teeming with millions of rats, protected by antibiotics that might not always work against evolving bacteria, trusting systems that might not always function when stressed by multiple crises, believing we have conquered plague when we have only temporarily suppressed it. The rat that changed everything is still here, thriving in numbers that dwarf medieval rat populations. It is living in the infrastructure we built to support 8 billion humans, eating the massive quantities of food we waste, reproducing in the countless spaces and crevices our complex cities provide. It is, in biological terms, extraordinarily successful by any measure, having colonized virtually every human settlement on Earth from Arctic villages to tropical megacities. And it still carries the potential for doom, not the inevitable doom that medieval people faced with their limited medical knowledge, but potential doom, contingent doom, doom that depends on circumstances we cannot completely control no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes. We have not eliminated the threat the rat represents. We have not broken the ecological relationship that makes rats successful in human environments, or that makes them effective disease vectors. We have only managed the threat through ongoing interventions that require constant effort and resources. And management is not the same as elimination. Management can fail when vigilance lapses or resources run short. The rat that carried humanity's doom in the 14th century is still carrying that potential today, waiting in the walls and sewers and cargo holds of our civilization. We are separated from medieval catastrophe not by biological evolution or inherent superiority or divine protection, but by the fragile, contingent tools of modern medicine and the even more fragile systems that produce and distribute those tools. And if those tools fail, if those systems collapse, if antibiotics stop working or public health infrastructure crumbles, the rat will still be there, thriving and adaptable and ready to play its ancient role as harbinger of plague. The rat that changed everything has not gone away. It has never gone away. It is here now, closer than you think, living its successful life in the shadow of human civilization, carrying within its fleas the same bacterium that once killed 1/3 of Europe. And it will be here long after we are gone, should we fail to maintain the vigilance required to keep ancient plagues at bay in our modern, connected, vulnerable world.